The camera light trembled as it followed the lonely road, catching the outline of a farmhouse that looked like it had been waiting for someone to notice it again. A thin buzzing slipped through the radio, rising from a whisper into something that sounded like breathing right beside the speaker. The house stood silent, yet the porch light blinked in slow, steady beats, almost like it was signaling. If there was no one inside who kept turning it on. And why did the dark around the doorway look thicker than the rest of the night? Gravel shifted under steady steps, each crunch echoing too loudly in the still air. A cold draft pushed from beneath the door, carrying a faint rattle that seemed to move deeper into the hallway, as though something invisible dragged a chain across the floorboards. The beam of the Bodycam trembled again, catching a fresh set of footprints forming in the dust. Orgsh, Kapwanti, Il Isai. They appeared one after another, slowly, carefully, made by something that left no shadow and no shape. Only marks and a deep, rising silence that felt like a warning. The doorway swallowed the light behind him as the floorboards groaned beneath each step, the sound stretching too long, as though the house echoed in a voice not its own. The air inside felt heavy, colder than the night outside, holding a damp stillness that clung to every breath. The beam of the camera drifted along peeling wallpaper and broken picture frames, yet none of them seemed to hang in quite the same way when the light returned to them. Something shifted in the next room, a soft scrape, then a slow drag, like furniture being moved deliberately by hands that didn't touch the ground. The sound repeated, closer this time. Dust rose from the floor in a thin ribbon, sliding toward the darkened hallway, as though pulled by an unseen tide. A faint whisper curled across the room, too hushed to understand, but too close to ignore, and then the walls trembled with a low vibration that faded the moment the camera turned toward it. Everything felt wrong, as if the house was adjusting itself to watch him better. The hallway stretched ahead like a tunnel bent slightly out of shape, its edges warping the camera's light as though the walls were breathing. A soft thump echoed from somewhere deeper inside, followed by another, each perfectly spaced as if something paced with calm, steady intention. The beam of the flashlight quivered as it passed over a broken mirror that carried no reflection, only a faint smear of motion that retreated the moment it was noticed. A chair at the far end trembled, slid an inch, then stopped as the air rippled around it. A cold rush swept down the hall, pushing the door behind him shut with a deep, echoing slam that made the house feel suddenly smaller. The radio at his shoulder hissed again with the same strange breathing, louder now, almost patterned. Then from the far end of the corridor, a thin voice whispered a single word. One that the Bodycam recorded clearly, though no one stood there to speak it. The house let out a deep groan as if shifting its weight, and the floor dipped slightly underfoot, forcing a careful, unsteady step. The sound of pacing returned, but this time it circled him, tapping lightly along the walls, always just beyond the beam of light. The kitchen doorway loomed ahead, its frame splintered, hanging crooked as though something had forced its way out instead of in. Shadows gathered near the counters, thick and pulsing, like they were waiting to take shape. A metal pot rolled across the floor with a gentle clink, stopping at his boot before spinning in place without being touched. The air grew colder still, filled with a faint rhythm, almost like a heartbeat hidden inside the walls. When he turned toward the pantry, the door creaked open on its own, revealing complete darkness inside. The camera light barely reached into it, but something inside shifted. A slow movement that stopped the moment the beam landed on it. The pantry door inched wider, with a long, aching creak, releasing a stale breath of air that smelled like old dirt and something metallic. The camera light trembled as it slid deeper inside, revealing shelves covered in dust and jars filled with shapes too clouded to identify. A single jar tipped over and rolled toward the edge without being touched, stopping just before it fell. Behind the shelves, a faint tapping began. A slow, steady knock that echoed from somewhere behind the wall itself. The knock grew louder, more forceful, as if something trapped inside wanted out. Then the tapping stopped completely, replaced by a long, dragging sound that traveled upward through the boards, climbing toward the ceiling. The temperature dropped so sharply, the breath in the air turned faintly visible. A final thud struck directly above, shaking loose dust in a soft rain. And the Bodycam captured the impossible, the ceiling boards bowing downward, bending as though something heavy pressed from the other side. The ceiling boards settled back into place with a soft shudder, leaving the air painfully still, as though the house had paused to listen. The hallway behind him darkened unnaturally fast, swallowing the faint moonlight that once slipped through the windows. The camera picked up a low hum vibrating through the walls, a steady pulse that matched neither machinery nor anything alive. The hum shifted pitch as he stepped out of the pantry, rising into a thin drone that tugged at the edges of hearing. Ahead, the living room lights flickered despite being disconnected, each burst of illumination revealing the furniture in slightly different positions, as if the room reset itself every time the darkness returned. A cold pressure built around him, tightening the air, making every movement feel slower and heavier. Then, without warning, the hum stopped completely. The silence that replaced it felt loaded, dense, waiting. And in that stillness, something scraped softly across the floor behind him, dragging closer. The scraping sound faded as quickly as it began, replaced by a distant thud from the second floor, heavy enough to shake dust from the ceiling. The staircase loomed ahead, its banister warped. Each step bowed as though the wood had softened under great weight. The camera light climbed the steps before he did, catching brief flashes of motion on the landing. Small, quick distortions that vanished when stared at directly. As he began to ascend, the air thickened again, humming faintly with a vibration that seeped into bone. Halfway up, the radio crackled with the same strange breathing, now layered with a faint whisper that repeated a single phrase too distorted to understand. The landing above grew darker the closer he stepped, as though the shadows recoiled and then reshaped themselves. At the top, a bedroom door stood wide open, swinging slightly even though the air was still. The sway stopped the moment he reached the final step, freezing as if it sensed him. The bedroom felt untouched for years, yet the air carried a strange warmth that didn't belong in the rest of the freezing house. The bed frame tilted slightly, one leg hovering an inch above the floor without support. The curtains fluttered, though the windows were sealed shut, their movements slow and deliberate, as if stirred by a careful hand. The camera glided past a dresser where every drawer was pulled open at identical angles, too perfect to be accidental. A faint tapping came from the closet door. Soft at first, then faster, forming a rhythm that felt intentional. The light shifted across the room, and for a split second, the shadows under the bed stretched farther than the beam should allow, reaching outward like thin fingers before snapping back into place. The tapping stopped abruptly, replaced by a quiet inhale from inside the closet, a sound unmistakably close, yet nothing moved. When the door creaked open on its own, the closet revealed only darkness at first, deeper than any shadow in the room. The camera light pushed through it, revealing a narrow crawl space cut roughly into the back wall. The wood splintered outward as if something had forced its way through. A faint draft drifted from the opening, warm and carrying a distant echo that sounded almost like a slow exhale. He crouched closer, the floorboards creaking beneath him, and the crawl space widened in the camera's perspective, distorting as though the walls inside pulsed with each breath. A soft knock traveled from somewhere within the tunnel, followed by a dragging sound that grew louder by the second. Then the temperature shifted sharply again, the warm draft replaced by a cold gust that blew outward hard enough to push dust across the floor. The dragging stopped. The entire crawl space fell silent, too silent, until a single whisper emerged from deep within, his own voice repeating a phrase he had never spoken. The whisper faded, leaving a ringing in the air as he backed away from the crawl space. The bedroom seemed different now, as if shifted slightly when he turned his back. The dresser drawers that once sat open were now fully shut, and the curtains had gone still, frozen mid-fold like fabric trapped in a moment. The camera caught a faint vibration moving along the floorboards, a ripple traveling toward the hallway door. Then, the door swung shut with a loud, hollow slam, trapping room in dim stillness. The sound of slow footsteps began outside, measured, steady, pacing from one end of the hallway to the other. The steps stopped directly in front of the bedroom door. A soft knock followed. Then another. The handle twitched once, twice, turning slightly but never fully engaging, as if something tested the mechanism with patient curiosity. Finally, the door handle stopped moving, and the silence that followed pressed heavily against the walls, waiting for him to move first. The silence outside the door swelled into something almost physical, pushing against the room like a slow, tightening breath. The camera captured the faintest tremor in the air, a vibration that made the shadows tremble along the walls. When he reached for the door, the handle felt warm, far too warm for a house colder than the night outside. The warmth pulsed once, like a heartbeat. He pulled his hand back, and the pulse stopped instantly. Then, without warning, the door clicked unlocked on its own, the sound sharp enough to cut the quiet. The handle turned slowly, deliberately, yet the door didn't open. It waited. When he nudged it, the hallway beyond stretched into a darkness deeper than before, swallowing even the camera's beam at its edges. A faint trail of dust drifted across the floor, moving as though dragged by an invisible presence leading deeper into the house. The air shifted, carrying a faint whisper that moved past him and down the stairs, urging him to follow. The stairs groaned with each step, but the groans no longer sounded like wood under weight. They carried faint tones, almost melodic, as though the house hummed to itself. The beam of the camera slid across the railing and caught streaks of fresh scratches running along its length. They hadn't been there before. They formed no pattern, yet they looked purposeful, carved with something moving fast. The living room below glowed faintly, even though no light source remained. As he reached the bottom step, a low vibration passed through the floorboards, making loose items tremble. Something shifted behind the couch, a quick dart of motion, too fast to identify, too tall to be human. The radio crackled again, this time whispering his own breathing back to him, a half-second delay. The delay grew, echoing longer with each sound he made. Then the couch slid 2 inches across the floor by itself, its movement slow, deliberate, like a warning to stay back. The glowing in the living room pulsed, in a slow rhythm, spreading across the floor like a thin mist of light. Each pulse revealed new details: the shifting couch, the trembling curtains, the floorboards subtly rising and falling as though something breathed beneath them. A soft thump sounded under his feet, then another, moving in a line across the room. The glow thickened near the wall, forming a vague outline that leaned forward before dissolving back into the floor. The camera strained to focus, flickering as though rejecting what it saw. When he stepped forward, the floorboards dipped slightly, then pushed up again, lifting his foot as if guiding him somewhere. The pulses of light brightened toward the hallway leading to the back of the house. A cold gust swept through, carrying a distant, muffled cry, too distorted to place, but unmistakably real. The glow narrowed into a path, pointing toward a door he had not noticed before. The hidden door creaked open before he touched it, releasing a draft that carried the scent of wet soil and something metallic. The narrow hallway beyond sloped downward at a strange angle, as though the house had grown around something not meant to be found. The walls were lined with deep scratches, long and jagged, carved in arcs too smooth to be random. The deeper he went, the more the air vibrated, a low pulse that matched the earlier glow in the living room. His footsteps echoed oddly, the sound splitting into 2 overlapping rhythms, one from him, and one from something following just a step behind. When he turned the beam of the camera back, nothing filled the hallway, yet the second rhythm kept going. Ahead, the passage widened into a small cellar, its floor covered in dried dirt that shifted as though stirred by a faint breeze. A single lantern flickered on, though no hand touched it. The cellar floor trembled underfoot, sending ripples through the dirt like something moving beneath the surface. The lantern's dim flame bent sideways as though pushed by a breath that came from no visible source. The camera light swept across old crates, torn blankets, and a makeshift table covered in scattered pages stained with dark rings. One page lifted slowly, rising into the air before drifting toward him in a slow, unnatural glide. As it reached eye level, the edges curled inward, forming strange symbols that glowed faintly before burning away to ash midair. A hollow thud struck the far wall, then another, each one forming a dent, as though pressed from the inside. The dents grew deeper, spreading across the boards in steady progression. The final thud landed harder than the rest, shaking the lantern. Then the boards split open, revealing a narrow gap filled with darkness so thick it swallowed the light completely. And something inside shifted toward the opening. The crack in the cellar wall widened with a sound like splintering bone, and the darkness behind it pulsed once, as though breathing in the lantern's glow. The air thickened, pushing against him with a force that felt strangely patient, like something testing his resolve. When he stepped back, the darkness pressed forward in a slow, steady swell, stopping just before it touched the light. The dust on the ground shifted around his boots, forming a faint spiral that tightened with each passing second. The radio picked up static again, but this time the sound wasn't breathing. It was heartbeat-like, slow and deep, echoing from inside the crack. The boards around the opening shuddered, bending inward as though being pulled from the other side. The heartbeat grew louder, then abruptly stopped. The single second of silence that followed felt enormous. Then came a whisper so faint it barely reached the microphone, drifting out of the darkness. Closer. He steadied his breath as the darkness retreated slightly, slipping back into the crack like water drawn through a drain. The lantern flickered violently, its flames stretching upward in thin, unnatural shapes that reached toward the ceiling. When he turned, the cellar space behind him seemed larger than before, as if the walls had subtly shifted outward. The scattered pages on the floor rustled, flipping over in synchronized motions that followed him as he moved. A dull vibration traveled through the dirt, then through the crates, making them rattle against the ground. The air continued to thicken, building pressure that tightened the chest and dulled each breath. A low groan drifted from the ceiling boards, followed by a soft trickling sound, dust falling in thin streams as though disturbed by movement above. The lantern dimmed again, leaving only the bodycam's beam, and in that narrow cone of light, a fresh set of footprints appeared in the dirt, leading toward the stairs. He followed the footprints cautiously, each step creaking louder than it should in the tightening air. The cellar stairs rose into a pocket of darkness that swallowed most of the camera's beam, leaving only a narrow ribbon of light on the steps. As he ascended, the boards beneath him seemed softer, flexing more than wood should. Halfway up, a cold pressure pushed against his back, firm enough to force him forward one step. The railing beside him bent slightly inward, warping as though reacting to the same unseen force. A faint hum vibrated through the stairwell, pulsing in slow, drawn-out waves. When he reached the top, the living room appeared unchanged at first glance, quiet, still, furniture in place. Then the glow returned, rippling across the floor in fast pulses that formed a clear path toward the front door. The doorknob twisted once, then again, as if something on the other side was waiting for him to come closer. The front door continued to twitch subtly, each movement slow and careful, almost polite. The pulsing glow crept across the floor like a thin tide, touching the baseboards before retreating again. The camera light swept across the windows, revealing only darkness outside, too dense to be natural night. When he approached the door, the glow dimmed, shrinking into small threads that coiled around his boots before slipping back across the room. The doorknob stopped moving just as he reached for it, freezing mid-turn. Then the whole door shuddered, not from impact, but from a deep vibration that came from the walls themselves. The hinges creaked. The frame bent outward slightly, as though pressured by an unseen weight. A soft tapping started, not on the outside surface, but within the thickness of the door, knocking from somewhere between the wood layers. Each knock sharpened, growing faster until it abruptly stopped, leaving only the quiet strain of the warped frame. The door frame gave a sudden, low crack before settling back into shape, its wood relaxing like something had withdrawn. The glow across the floor darkened, compressing into a tight circle at the center of the room. As he stepped toward it, the floorboards around the circle trembled, swelling upward slightly as if stirred from below. The circle expanded in a slow ripple, revealing a thin fissure forming beneath the surface. A deep, distant rumble shook the walls, though nothing outside appeared to move. The fissure widened just enough for cold air to spill out, drifting upward in thin strands that twisted around the camera's beam. The air hummed again, this time rising sharply like a strained breath. The fissure stopped widening, but the cold air kept flowing, stronger, colder, lifting loose dust into spinning coils. In the final moment, the circle of glow reappeared, now brighter and perfectly still, centered directly over the shaking boards. The glow beneath the floor grew sharper, outlining the fissure with a thin ring of trembling light that pulsed faster than before. The boards thumped once from below, hard enough to shift dust across the room, then fell silent as though bracing for something. When he stepped back, the glow dimmed, shrinking like it sensed the distance. But the moment he leaned in again, it brightened and swelled outward in a slow, spiraling motion. A faint rumble rose through the foundation, vibrating the air so deeply the camera sound momentarily warped. The walls trembled, shedding flecks of paint that drifted like ash to the ground. A sudden cold swept through the house, strong enough to sting the skin, followed by a distant metallic screech from somewhere far below the floor. The fissure widened another inch, releasing a rush of freezing air that moved like a slow exhale. And beneath that exhale, something tapped twice. Clear, deliberate, as if signaling. The tapping continued in a steady rhythm, matched by small pulses of light flickering along the fissure's edge. He crouched slightly, and the pulses grew brighter, reacting as if aware of the movement. The air shimmered above the boards, bending the camera's view like heat rising off pavement, except the temperature had dropped sharply enough to sting each breath. A thin strand of light rose from the fissure, floating upward and twisting into a spiral before fading into nothing. Another emerged, then another, each drifting unpredictably as though guided by an unseen pattern. The walls groaned again, this time in a deep, rolling wave that traveled from one end of the house to the other. Something shifted behind him, light and quick, followed by the soft scrape of fabric brushing the floor. When he turned, nothing stood there. Only a shadow stretching slightly too long, retracting quickly once noticed. A sharp crack split through the floor, louder than any before, and the fissure widened enough for the light inside to spill upward like a rising fog. The boards around it began to lift and settle in odd rhythms, pulsing unevenly like muscle reacting to a distant signal. The camera captured faint shapes, moving within the glow. Shadows twisting independently of the light, sliding across each other in slow, fluid arcs. The air thickened again, pressing down on his chest with heavy, deliberate weight. Then the glow shifted, focusing in a single direction, toward him. It lifted in a thin, narrow beam that stretched to his feet, tracing the outline of his boots before circling him in a slow, deliberate loop. A whisper drifted out. Several voices layered together, none speaking a full word, yet all moving in the same rising tone. The floorboards trembled beneath the beam, as though anticipating his next step. The circling beam of light tightened, forming a narrow ring around him that spun slowly across the floor. As it moved, the boards beneath it bent downward, as if softened by heat, even though the air remained painfully cold. Wah! The layered whispers grew louder, rising into a soft hum that wrapped around the room, vibrating the walls in slow, expanding pulses. A gust of air pushed outward from the fissure with sudden force, sending loose objects skidding across the floor. The ring of light stopped spinning and froze at his left side, pointing directly toward the back hallway. A dim outline formed there, a shape barely visible, shimmering like a reflection in disturbed water. It flickered once, then vanished as the hallway lights popped on with a harsh electric snap, even though the power line had long been cut. The hum stopped, and in the stillness that followed, the ring of light broke apart and scattered like dust. The fragments of light drifted upward like glowing embers, dissolving before they reached the ceiling. The house returned to an uneasy quiet, broken only by the faint ticking of settling floorboards around the fissure. When he stepped away, the glow dulled but did not disappear. It steadied into a slow pulse, like a heartbeat waiting to rise again. The camera caught movement near the front window, just a slight shift in the darkness outside, as if something large had stepped closer to the glass. The window pane quivered, then a soft, scraping drag sounded from the other side, traveling from one edge of the window frame to the other with deliberate patience. The glow from the fissure brightened in response, climbing the walls in thin streaks of pale light. The window went still, but the scrape continued, now coming from the inside, directly behind the wall beside him. The scraping moved higher inside the wall, dragging upward toward the ceiling with slow, steady strokes that vibrated through the studs. The air thickened again, carrying a faint, metallic scent that grew sharper with every breath. The fissure behind him pulsed in quick, uneven flashes, as though reacting to something approaching from inside the walls. When he took a step toward the hallway, the floorboards shifted under his weight, not sinking, but lifting slightly, as if something underneath pushed back. The scraping stopped at the ceiling and held there in perfect silence, the kind that made the entire house feel suspended. Then the ceiling creaked once, low and long, followed by a faint tap, tap, moving directly above him. The tap circled slowly, tracking his position wherever he stepped. When he paused, the taps paused. When he moved, they followed. And then, from above, came a soft thud, gentle, deliberate, like a warning. The thud overhead traveled toward the back hallway, shaking loose dust in a thin, drifting line. He followed slowly, and the hallway seemed to stretch ahead longer than before, its shadows drawn tight along the walls like smears of ink. The camera beam flickered as it moved across peeling paint, revealing spots where scratches appeared fresh, carved seconds ago. A soft pattering rose above, moving in quick bursts, too fast to be footsteps, too deliberate to be random. The pattering stopped directly above the hallway door, and a gentle creaking sounded from the attic access panel. It shifted once, quivering as though nudged from below. The faint metallic scent sharpened again, making the air feel thinner. Suddenly the panel trembled violently, rattling in place, as if something pushed upward from the other side. Then it stopped, completely, unnervingly still, before the sound of slow breathing drifted through the narrow cracks. The access panel finally settled, its rattling replaced by a low, rhythmic creak that echoed like the sway of a heavy rope. He approached carefully, the floor beneath him bending more than before, the boards flexing as though softened by unseen heat. The breathing above deepened, slow and raspy, moving from one end of the attic to the other. The camera caught a faint plume of dust falling through the cracks, drifting down in trembling patterns that twisted midair. The house exhaled again, a deep, uneven gust that traveled through the vents and across the hallway in a cold wave. Then something slid across the attic floor, heavy and scraping, stopping directly above the access panel. A soft knock tapped down from the other side, not threatening but intentional, like someone asking for patience. The knock repeated twice more. Then everything overhead went still, leaving the air strained and waiting. He reached for the panel slowly, and the moment his fingers brushed its edge, the breathing above stopped completely. The silence hit so suddenly it felt physical, pressing against his ears. The panel slid open without resistance, rising a few inches as though lifted from the other side. Cold air flooded down, carrying the smell of earth and damp wood. The attic above lay in near total darkness, the camera beam dissolving at the edges before revealing anything solid. He raised the light slowly, and for a brief moment the beam caught something moving, just a faint ripple across the rafters, too fast to follow. The rafters creaked with a slow shift, as if adjusting under new weight. Then the glow from the living room fissure pulsed again, brighter than before, sending a thin streak of light racing up the hallway wall. The streak vanished into the attic above, and something inside shifted in response, closer now, waiting at the edge of the light. The house groaned from somewhere deep within its frame, a sound thick enough to rattle the fixtures. As he drew back from the attic opening, the breathing returned, closer now, paced and steady. The fissure's glow brightened again, spreading thin lines of light that crawled across the hallway floor like roots searching for a path. The walls trembled lightly, releasing tiny flecks of wood that drifted like ash. Then the attic panel slammed shut with a violent crack, shaking the lights and sending a burst of cold air across his face. The glow on the floor reacted instantly, tightening into a single bright line stretching toward the living room. A distant thud echoed through the house, then another, each one deeper and closer. The line of light pulsed once, twice, then began sliding slowly across the floor, as if guiding him back downstairs, back toward the widening fissure and whatever waited beneath it. The glowing line on the floor slid ahead of him with slow, deliberate motion, pulling him back toward the living room like a quiet summons. Each step he took made the air heavier, denser, until breathing felt like wading through cold fog. The glow brightened near the fissure, spreading like a tide across the boards. The trembling beneath the floor returned, stronger than before, shaking the room in short, rising bursts. The camera caught faint ripples of light rising from the fissure, bending and twisting in shapes that refused to hold still. A low hum vibrated through the house, deeper than any sound he'd heard yet, pushing through the walls like a swallowed roar. The boards at the center of the glow bowed downward suddenly, forming a shallow dip as if something immense pressed from below. Then the hum stopped. The floor froze. The glow dimmed to a faint pulse, and from beneath the boards came a long, dragging inhale. The inhale continued, slow and deep, pulling dust and loose debris inward toward the fissure as though the house itself were breathing. A cold wind swirled around him in uneven bursts, slicing through the room without any clear direction. The camera caught the glow sharpening again, rising from the fissure in long vertical strands that swayed like grass in a storm. The floorboards shifted beneath his boots, no longer trembling, but flexing as though something alive moved directly under them. A faint resonance echoed from the walls, a metallic ring that traveled in slow waves around the room. The fissure widened another inch with a soft crack, spreading jagged lines across the boards. The glowing strands bent inward at once, pulled toward the center like drawn breath. And then in the quiet that followed, a voice rose from below, layered, distant, perfectly still, whispering his name as though it had always known it. The whisper faded into a deep rumble that vibrated through the foundation, shaking dust loose from the ceiling in drifting clouds. The fissure brightened until the room swayed with the glow, turning shadows into long, distorted shapes that stretched across the walls. He stepped back, but the glow followed him in a spreading circle, chasing his boots in smooth ripples. A sudden blast of heat surged upward from the fissure, followed instantly by a freezing wave that numbed the air. The boards around the opening bent upward, splitting with sharp cracks that echoed like gunshots. Something moved within the light, slow, deliberate, its form never fully visible, shifting like smoke trapped underwater. The rumbling deepened again, then stopped as the light abruptly narrowed into a thin column that shot upward to the ceiling, flickering violently before collapsing back into the fissure with a single, resonant pulse. The pulse from the fissure rolled outward in a heavy wave that rattled every fixture in the room. The glow dimmed to a faint ember-like shimmer, pulsing just enough to reveal movement beneath the board. Slow, rising pressure pushed against the floor, bowing it upward in growing arcs. The air thickened again, carrying the same metallic scent that haunted the walls earlier, now sharper, and impossible to ignore. The camera caught a thin crack, racing across the wall, splitting the paint in a jagged path, as though marking a countdown. The boards near the fissure bulged higher, straining against their nails with low groans. Then the breathing from below returned. Deeper, closer, shaping the air with each slow exhale. The fissure brightened one last time, not in a steady glow but in fast, trembling flashes. And in those flashes, the shadows cast along the walls twisted into shapes that almost looked like reaching hands. The flashes quickened until the room felt like it flickered in and out of reality, each burst revealing the floor, rising higher, the boards curving like warped metal. A final crack snapped through the house, louder than any before, and the boards gave way, splitting open in a violent burst that sent debris rolling across the room. A column of cold air shot upward, scattering dust into spiraling clouds. The camera struggled to focus as the glow surged from deep below, revealing only shifting motion. No shape, no clear outline, just movement that defied the beam of light. The room's temperature plunged, frost crawling across the nearest boards in delicate patterns. The glow reached its peak, then collapsed inward with a sudden sharp implosion that sucked loose debris back into the opening. The fissure closed just enough to hide what was beneath, leaving only a faint pulse of light in the cracks and a silence that settled like something unfinished.